Hello, and welcome back to Ranger in Time, Disaster on the Titanic. In this video, we'll be reading chapters 7 through 9. Chapter 7, Rising Waters. Patrick and Ranger hurried up to the deck. Everyone was talking at once. Is everything all right? Why have we stopped? Don't suppose it's anything much. Perhaps something to do with the machinery. It's fine, one of the crewmen told a group of passengers. You can go back to bed. Some people returned to their cabins. Others huddled in their nightgowns on the deck. It was an iceberg, I tell you, someone said. Saw the huge white mass myself when I looked out my porthole, like a mountain on the sea. Come on, dog, Patrick said, hurrying toward the bow of the ship. Let's see what we can learn. Ranger followed Patrick, but the fur on his neck prickled. The air smelled icy, fishy, and dangerous. Then Ranger felt something cold under his paw. He barked and stepped back. Patrick bent down, picked up a chunk of ice, and sucked in his breath. We must have hit ice, he whispered. He looked out into the darkness and tried to stay calm. The ship was designed to sail through icy waters, he reminded himself. Sure enough, the engines chugged to life, and the ship started moving. Patrick let out a whoosh of breath. "See, dog," he said. "Everything is fine." Patrick had seen the Titanic's plans himself back at the shipyard. He'd counted the watertight compartments that would keep the great ship from sinking no matter what. These were separate rooms on the lower levels of the ship, with special doors that could close in an emergency. That way, if water got into the ship's hull, it would be kept to one small area. It could never flood the entire ship. So even though the Titanic had hit an iceberg, they would be fine. This might slow them down a bit. That was all. Then the engine stopped again. Two firemen came rushing up the steps. "She's flooding," one of them shouted. "The watertight doors are closed, but who knows if it'll be enough. We had to dive under the door between boiler rooms 5 and 6 as it was closing. Made it just in time." "Go wake the first class passengers," an officer told Patrick. "Get them up to the boat deck in their life jackets. Tell them it's just a precaution. We don't want to alarm them." Patrick hesitated. "Is there cause for alarm?" The officer pointed down the stairs. "Follow the orders you've been given." Patrick and Ranger hurried downstairs. They rushed up and down the first-class hallways. Ranger barked. Patrick pounded on the cabin doors to wake people up. He helped them into their life jackets and sent them up to the deck. Some people argued. "It's so dreadfully frigid out," one woman said. "Is the ship actually taking on water?" one man asked Patrick. "Have you seen it for yourself?" He looked around his warm, dry cabin. "No, sir," Patrick said, "but I've been told that everyone must head up to the boat deck now." The man sighed. He pulled a coat on over his nightclothes and followed Patrick and Ranger down the hall and up the stairs. The boat deck was getting crowded, but no one seemed very worried. Their only complaint was the temperature of the air. Was it really necessary to be out in this awful cold? When Patrick finished waking the first-class passengers, he ran downstairs to see the damage for himself. It would be on the lower levels of the ship, near the mailroom and one of the boiler rooms, near Hamad and Miriam's cabin. Ranger followed Patrick. With every flight of stairs they descended, the air smelled more dangerous, like wet metal and seawater and ice. When Patrick turned a corner to go down to the mailroom, he stopped in his tracks. Seawater had already climbed halfway up the staircase. The baggage area, mailroom, and boiler rooms were all flooded. Ranger saw the water too, but he started down the stairs. "No," Patrick called. "Here, dog. We can't go down there. We have to go up to the deck." But mixed in with the smell of seawater, soggy paper, and wet coal, Ranger had caught another scent, a person smell. He continued down the stairs until the water lifted him off his paws and he was paddling through the mailroom. "Dog, no," Patrick shouted. He took another step down. Frigid water soaked his boots. "Come back," he called to Ranger. Ranger barked and kept paddling. The person smell was getting stronger. There! A young steward clung to a pipe in the corner of the room. Ranger barked at him. Get help, dog, the young man shouted. He hadn't seen Patrick, but it was Patrick who answered. I'm here. It's all right. Let go and come to the stairs. I can't swim, the man shouted. It's not that deep, Patrick called. Come on. But the man shook his head. His knuckles were white from gripping the pipe so tightly. Hold on, then. I'm coming. Patrick took a deep breath and braced himself for the shock. Then he plunged into the icy flood. Chapter 8, Ready the Lifeboats. The frigid water stole Patrick's breath away. It swallowed him up all the way to his neck and lapped at his chin. Patrick kept his head up. He pushed through the water, half swimming and half running to the corner of the mailroom. He took hold of the young steward's arm. Let go of the pipe now, Patrick said. The water's not over your head. I'll make sure you don't fall. The man's eyes were wide with fear. His hands stayed clenched around the pipe. Ranger swam to him and used his nose to give the man's cheek a wet nudge. Finally, the man took a deep breath. He let go of the pipe and let Patrick guide him to the steps. Ranger walked behind them, nudging the young man every time he looked back at the flood. They needed to get upstairs, away from this dangerous, rising water. When they'd climbed up to the E deck, Patrick heard voices in the hallway. One of them sounded like Mr. Andrews from the shipyard. Patrick stopped and put a finger to his lips. The other man nodded silently. They waited in the stairway as two men walked by. Well, 3 have gone already, Captain, one of the men said. If 6 of the watertight compartments flood, she can't stay afloat. The men's footsteps paused. Are you certain? The other man asked. The weight of the seawater will sink the bow, and the rest of the ship will follow, the first man said. How long do we have? Perhaps 2 hours. Patrick's stomach turned to stone. 2 hours? 2 hours before the greatest ship in the world would sink? He turned to the young steward, who stood shivering in his wet clothes. His mouth hung open. He stared at Patrick. 2 hours, mate, the man whispered. Patrick nodded. He swallowed hard. Let's get to work. They hurried up to the boat deck where the Titanic's lifeboats were tied. More passengers had come up from their cabins. Some dragged soggy suitcases behind them. Soon the musicians arrived with their instruments. The band tuned up and began playing Alexander's Ragtime Band. Passengers stood in groups, listening, talking quietly, and laughing. All hands up, someone shouted. Get the lifeboats ready. The crewmen on deck sprung into action, but the passengers barely looked up from their conversations. Patrick couldn't stop staring. Had anyone told them the ship was going to sink? He wondered if the crew was working too hard to keep people calm. Would they even be willing to get in the lifeboats? Come on, mate, another crewman clapped Patrick on the shoulder. Help ready the boats. Patrick and Ranger followed the man to the starboard side of the ship. Patrick began pulling the covers from the lifeboats. Release the grips on that one, another man called. Patrick could barely hear him over the sound of steam pouring from the ship's funnels. Release the grips, the man shouted. Patrick did that and then began preparing ropes so the boat could be lowered. Other crew members prepared the davits, the cranes that would lower full lifeboats into the sea. The captain has given the order to swing out the boats, someone called. Bring up the passengers with life preservers on. Women and children first. Patrick looked at the crowd on the deck. There were 20 lifeboats in all. Could it possibly be enough for 2,000 passengers and crew members? There was no time to do the math. Patrick turned a crank to position lifeboat number 7 alongside the ship. It swung on its ropes, and his heart crept up into his throat. He couldn't imagine climbing into such a little boat as it tipped back and forth 70 feet above the ocean. Patrick pushed the thought away. With so many passengers waiting, it would be a long time before it was his turn to board a lifeboat anyway. He held the boat steady as 2 of the passengers, a woman and her mother, climbed aboard. One by one, Patrick helped 28 people board Lifeboat 7 before it launched. There'd been room for more, but other passengers were staying back. They still didn't believe the ship might sink. Patrick understood. It seemed impossible, but he remembered hearing Mr. Andrews in the E-deck hallway. Maybe 2 hours. How long ago had that been? And how much time was left? Chapter 9. Not Without My Brother. Lower away, an officer shouted toward Lifeboat 5. If Mr. Andrews was right, there was far too much work to be done in the minutes they had left before the ship sank. The crew was doing all they could to prepare lifeboats and load passengers. Mr. Andrews himself hurried around the deck, urging people to get into the boats. They tried to board women and children first, but every time the crew turned away, men leaped into the boats. Women wailed for their husbands left behind on deck. Some threatened to get out of the boats if the men weren't allowed to join them. Eventually, the officer in charge let some men board Lifeboat 5 as well. Every time Patrick finished a job, there was another to be done. He was removing the sail and mast from a lifeboat to make room for more passengers when a scream came from Lifeboat 5, halfway down the side of the ship. The crew had lowered one side faster than the other. The tilted boat threatened to dump all of its passengers into the freezing ocean. Patrick dropped the mast on the deck and rushed to help. Quickly, he and the other crewmen raised their Lifeboat 5 back to the boat deck until it was level again. More men scrambled aboard. Patrick's heart thudded. He tried to catch his breath. He hadn't eaten supper, and his knees threatened to give out under him. He reached out for the railing to steady himself, but sank to his knees. Ranger came up to nuzzle his shoulder. Patrick sat down and stroked Ranger's fur, but it didn't calm his racing heart. His empty stomach twisted. The ship felt as if it might be tilting forward. Were they already starting to go down? Ranger sniffed the night air. It still smelled of seawater and ice, but there were new smells, too. So many people sweating under their thick coats. Danger and fear and bread. Ranger left Patrick and sniffed along the railing. Yes, bread. What'd you find there, dog? Patrick followed Ranger and picked up a sack from the deck. It was stuffed with loaves of bread. He looked around. There was more bread scattered near the lifeboats. The crew must have meant to load it on board. Patrick pulled a loaf from the sack. He tore off a hunk of bread and took a huge bite. He ripped off a second piece and gave it to Ranger. Then he leaned against the railing and stared up at the night sky. A streak of light, like a shooting star, shot up from the ship. A shower of white sparks exploded over the Titanic. It lit up the faces of the passengers waiting on the deck. Patrick watched as their expressions changed from surprise to awe to fear. Somehow, the emergency rocket launch had made them understand what they wouldn't listen to before. They were in danger. It was time to leave the ship. Patrick scrambled to his feet and hurried to prepare the next lifeboat. Ranger couldn't help Patrick with his work, so he wandered among the passengers. Even in the chaos and fear, people reached down to stroke his damp fur or scratch his neck. Ranger stayed longest with the people whose hands were trembling the most. He was getting a good ear scratch from a man in a top hat when a cry went up from the deck below. Ranger trotted to the rail to see what was happening. A mob of passengers crowded behind a gate that led up to the boat deck. They were arguing and surging forward. On the other side, a steward was pushing them back. An officer shot a gun into the air. Women and children only, he shouted. The steward reached over the gate to lift a little girl, but she pushed him away. No, I won't go, she said. Ranger's ears perked up. It was Miriam. The steward said something. He caught the girl's hand and yanked her forward. Then he grabbed her under her arms and dragged her over the gate. No. She pounded his shoulders and kicked at him. Not without my brother. And this wraps up reading for chapters 7 through 9.